Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of The Lion, the Way, and the War. We talk about Jesus, his church, and the spiritual battle that surrounds us all. My name's Brandon Bonner.
And I'm Craig Allison.
And we'll be your hosts.
Good job. All right, welcome back, everybody, to yet another episode. We are going to transition the topics. We're moving out of. If you've listened to the past episodes, you can see kind of we're boxing these things into like separate categories, and we're going to move into some family dynamic stuff. So today we're going to be talking about how raising kids is difficult. All the issues that come about raising kids, trying to raise our children in a good Christian environment with all of the pressures and the environmental, the culture stuff that's going on. So it's hard. It's hard to do that. So we're gonna jump into that. I've got some talking points here that we're gonna be talking about. I am a parent. You're not.
I'm not.
But you have some observations, I think, that you can make as far as being raised in the culture that we're talking about.
Yep.
So we're gonna just jump right in. And really, this question, I'm hoping that we're gonna get to a deeper answer to, which is how do we raise children who love Jesus deeply when everything around them is telling them to love the world? And so that's a huge issue.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, initial reaction to that question is by example. As a child, I'm not a parent, but as a child, I observed pretty heavily. You watch your parents and parental figures in your life, and you observe them in the way they act and their perspective, and you pick up on those things because, that's your whole life for a large portion of your childhood. Aside from a couple friends, the only thing that you know is your parents.
Yeah. What's interesting, too, is I don't think parents appreciate just how small of a window they actually have to instill a good solid foundation, and if they slack off during those early years, it's not long. It's 5 years old basically, and other people have your kids longer than you do. They enter the school system, preschool or whatever, and so literally they're with other people more hours of the day than they are with the parents, and so it's pivotal what they're seeing and learning during those first 5 years, and so I think that's one of the things that as parents we need to be considering. So along those lines then, the question that I pose is, are we more intentional then with our child rearing than social media or school or peer influence? So that question to parents is, are we being more intentional, recognizing the fact that we have that small window? What's your observation on that, Brandon?
So, as you mentioned, I'm not a parent, but I also am in a stage where I'm working a full-time job. My wife works a full-time job. And so at the end of the day, when you come home, you're pretty worn out.
Yeah.
So I can definitely see how, and this is the same for marriage as I'm sure it is for being a parent, but I could see, especially if you're a working parent, it could be easy to kind of put on autopilot and not intentionally letting, social media or peers or school be the main source of influence, but just as a byproduct of kind of our culture of being busy bees and busy bodies, you've went years where you're just on autopilot as a parent or autopilot as a spouse, and next thing you know, you've passed the point of having a very significant, impact on your child.
Yeah. One of the things that, when I think back before we had kids, I was not necessarily thinking about this topic. I was so engrossed in just the process of being a new dad, having a little infant at home, all the safety stuff, just the changes in lifestyle, the rhythm of the home life completely changes. To your point, how do we now juggle this little dependent creature that we've got, that we have responsibility for, with our school schedule? How do I not warp this little baby?
Yep.
And for me, that was a real issue because I have a tendency to warp young minds if I'm not careful, because I'm so weird in so many different places. And I own that. But yeah, we're talking about the rhythm then of life. And I think one of the things that's easier said than done is, like, if I'm giving you advice, is start thinking now before you even have kids about what that rhythm is going to look like, where Christ is going to be the center of that daily rhythm. So what types of things are you going to be doing? And it's not. This becomes more important as your child begins to develop language and verbal skills and begins, looking. I'm not talking about infants, because that's just man, that's a hard time for parents. I mean, you don't sleep. It's all about survival, basically, for those first 6 to 8 months of life. But then as your child begins to grow and develop, those rhythms already need to be established and in place. I know parents who just stop going to church when they have children, at least young children, because it's hard, it's difficult. That's the opposite of what I'm talking about. Even though the child may not remember going to church, you are already establishing those types of rhythms. So if I'm giving parents to be a piece of advice, that would be one of the things that I say to them. What would be your expectations there? Like, do you have pushback on that?
No, I mean, I think 100%. Now, it's easy for me to say because I don't have a child, so it's like, yeah, you should go to church. But I definitely can see how it's important for people like myself or people that are about to become parents to instill, positive spiritual habits and behaviors. So when life changes and drastically changes with introducing someone that's completely dependent on you in an extremely challenging part of life, that you've established those spiritual behaviors and patterns, so at least you're rooted in that, and so you can continue to be rooted, so that child also picks on those spiritual habits and behaviors. So I think that's super important. And again, I'm not saying that I do all those things, but I definitely have thought about, Lexi and I have talked about, it's important for us to have positive spiritual habits now, not try to figure it out once the child's already here, because at that point you're trying to survive and trying to change your spiritual habits.
And I can tell you from experience, I can't remember exactly when it was, but our kids were little, and I say kids, I don't think our youngest was born yet, so it was just the older two. And we drifted out of the habit of getting up on Sundays and going to church, and then going back on Sunday nights and Wednesday nights. And I can tell you, like, the first few times we did that, more than just the first few times, and I guess let me back up and say there were some reasons why that was super hard, because we were both working different schedules. I was on night shifts and then would switch doing some swing shift stuff. So it became really hard, especially when I worked, all day Saturday and Saturday night, and then I'd roll in on Sunday morning and trying to get the kids together. And Betsy's also, her schedule was. So, all of these things that I'm using, as an excuse for not to go to church. And we justified it. And the first few times we did that, it was really hard. We felt guilty. But it was amazing how quickly it became so much easier to not do that, and we just weren't thinking about it anymore. And then that became the new rhythm. And do you know this about me?
Nope.
Okay, so I hope Betsy doesn't get mad for me disclosing this little dark secret of the Allisons. That, we were skipping church as parents, and not just skipping church and worship, but all the things, the community, everything that is so needed that goes with that. So I say all that to say that I think that's a common thing that people do. And then when you do that long enough and your kids do begin to get to an age where they recognize that kind of stuff, going back is super awkward, because then it's like, what are you doing? Why are we going here? Right. What is this about? And that's tough. And it sets you up for those kind of like, how can I talk to my kids about going to church when I didn't go?
Yeah.
Yeah,
and something else too that I was thinking of, community is super important. And I think you and I may have talked about this a few weeks back about, Lexi and I are very blessed to have a very strong community of friends that we've, grown up with, high school, college, and so forth, post-college. And so having that strong community, if Lexi and I were to have a kid right now, which we're not, this is not an announcement, but if we were having to happen to
Surprise!
have a kid right now, and we did pull back and stop going to church, I mean, it'd be a different ball game. Because
Yeah.
like, hey, why aren't you? You know, there's some accountability there. There's a
Right.
community there that we would have to remove ourselves from, which would be extremely difficult. But also that community would surround us and provide, you know, support and accountability of like, hey, you know, you need,
Call you out on it.
yeah, you need to be in church.
Yeah, that's interesting you said that, because that's not that me and Betsy were antisocial, but we didn't have that. And so there wasn't really that piece of accountability, and it was much easier for us to do. So yet another added benefit of community. So I want to talk a little bit about materialism versus contentment. How do we raise grateful, content kids when everything around them says that more is better? And we've touched on this this idea of like, what is your identity and that kind of thing, and establishing identity. And for our young kids today that are being raised with a Christian worldview, that pressure to adapt the culture of the world is really, really huge. So, from a parental standpoint, then this becomes vitally important, because if we're as parents trying to raise our kids to be like kingdom kids, to be lovers of Christ, do our kids see contentment modeled from the parents? Because if they don't, you know, if we're caught up in materialism and worldly things, then how can we preach that to our kids?
Yeah, and this is this I could definitely see how this could be extremely challenging because you got two forces at play here. First off, you know, you work hard, you know, have the position, the ability to buy things or get things that you maybe never were able to obtain in the past, and so that can be very enticing.
Yep.
And you think about it, it's like, well, there's nothing inherently wrong with buying X, Y, and Z, and maybe that's the case. But again, you know, your kids are very observant and they're watching. So there's that force at play, but there's also the force of, you know, as you mentioned, they're going to be around other kids that who knows what kind of access they have to materialistic things, which again are not inherently bad. So how do you even begin to teach that to a child of like, hey, I'm glad, you know, Billy Bob has all these great things, and that's, you know, that's fine, but we have to be content in what we have, and here's why we're sacrificing this, and it is to further the kingdom, because, you know, if we're sacrificing these things, we can be better disciples because we can use our funds to be more generous or give to the church or XYZ, you know, go on and go on. So I've always thought it admirable. I know some parents, some that I work with, that, you know, for Christmas they don't really get their kids a ton of, like, a few small things, but they, you know, pull their money to give gifts to families that are in need or go serve at some sort of, you know, food bank or whatever it might be. And I've always thought that was super impressive, and just wondering, like, what are the values, what are the things that a kid's picking up on if every Christmas, you know, typically a holiday where there's a lot of gifts exchanged, them being the ones that are giving gifts or giving service or, you know, participating and providing for those that are in need.
Yeah, I think it sets a huge precedent as far as the impression, their takeaway is that, you know, my parents care about other people. It's not just about them. It's not just about them obtaining stuff for themselves. And unfortunately, I think a lot of kids that are being raised in quote unquote Christian homes are very focused on the materialistic world. What they think about when they think of mom and dad is a parental system that is always trying to climb that ladder higher and higher and higher, obtaining more stuff, comparing themselves to, you know, what the neighbors have, who's got the nicest car, who's going to the nicest school, who's got the more, you know, the most stuff. Well, all of those things. And again, not to harp on, you know, wealth or anything like that, because, and we'll address that topic later on. You know, is it okay for our Christians to be wealthy? But you know, this dives in. What are you doing with that money? I mean, is it balanced, or is it so lopsided that your kids' takeaway from that is my mom and dad care a lot about stuff, and I don't really see them living out the gospel, like I hear at church, like I hear people talking about. I don't see that at home, and so that's a tough questions that parents have to ask themselves. Hebrews chapter 13, verse 5, talking about being free from the love of money. Matthew 6, don't lay treasures up here on earth. You need to be laying treasure up in heaven. So these are things that we know from Scripture. The question is whether or not moms and dads are actually living that out for their kids to see.
So question for you as a parent. Typically I would say most of the time folks contribute to an offering, and that contribution is probably not like you're not holding up how much you're contributing. You're either doing online, writing a check, whatever it is.
Yeah.
And so do you, as a parent, make your kids aware of that financial transaction that you're doing? Like, how do you teach your child, I guess, that's...
When they were able to understand, they reached an age of understanding. I think they would, if they ask, hey, do your parents give to the church? They would all three say yes, and they would probably be able to say that, and they give every single Sunday. Mm-hmm. When they got old and began to understand money, we talked about giving, and we talked about the very first thing you do with your money when you get a paycheck. The very first thing you do is you set aside money for God. And the question, well, how much? That the New Testament is not giving direct numbers there. Tithing was part of the Old Testament, so 10%. Mm-hmm. But the idea there, the spirit of that, is that God wants the best. He doesn't want leftovers. And so I took that, and that's what I taught my kids. I said, the first thing you do with your money before you do anything else, even before you put money in savings, which is the second thing I told them to do, is that you set aside the money for God. Mm-hmm. And we should be giving sacrificially too. So when I look at the end of the month, I look at my bank statement, and if I've spent more money on going out to eat than I have on giving to God, personally, I think there's some issues there. I think that's a problem. And so I want to be able to tell my kids, without feeling like a hypocrite,
sure,
pay God first. It's His money anyway.
Right.
You're just giving it back. And what I have found is the more that I have given, the more God has blessed me. It's a fundamental truth. So that's my answer to your question.
Yeah, I was just, curious because I didn't grow up in church, and so I never thought about that until now. Like, how do you teach a child about this is giving and this is what it means, and it's sacrificial on top of like going serving, giving to the community, giving to the needy, but this is also something that's, something we're supposed to do, which in turn ties to why we have to be content. Because if we're not content, to your point, we can go out to eat all the time.
Yeah.
We give $10 a month to God. That may not compute, especially to a child.
Yeah, and they need to see it. I think examples. I can remember my parents sitting next to them in church, or at least my mom, because my dad was usually preaching. But they would give me my allowance because I did chores and stuff, and I would get that on Sunday during church. So they knew I had money in my hand, and I recognized this is my money. I earned it, and then I knew that I had eyes watching me, and I would give that money. So, and they were setting that example for me early on in life. Like some of my earliest memories was about giving back to God.
You sure Barb wasn't taken out of the collection plate and given your side?
Maybe she was. Here's your weekly allowance. That's funny. All right. This third point, having truth in a confusing world. How do we teach biblical truth with both conviction and compassion in a culture that challenges nearly every belief? And I think about 2 Timothy chapter 3, all scripture is breathed out from God. It's profitable for rebuking, correcting, and teaching. And so are we equipping our kids to understand why they believe and not just what they believe? And so I'm thinking about previous podcasts where I would talk to a lot of students about their faith being their faith. And you probably have some things to say about that.
Yeah, this is something I've thought a lot about. Again, I didn't grow up in the church, so my journey was truly different. It wasn't modeled necessarily after my parents. It was just a journey of me finding Christ, and so I've thought a lot about, like, how do you teach your child that they should find their own faith without just acting out on your own faith, but also you still need to bring them to church and enforce these spiritual behaviors. So how do you balance this? So I've thought a lot about it, and I think really what it boils down to, and what I've seen a lot of, being the youth minister here in the past and working with parents and seeing kids go through the youth program, being at the student center and college ministry, what I've kind of noticed is there tends to be this, I guess, stigma or image that's put up by parents, like they have to have it all together, and from a spiritual standpoint and a financial standpoint and being responsible, like everything has to be perfect. Marriage, and we know that's not reality. Mm-hmm. And so I think the lack of parents being genuine with their kids and having difficult conversations and being honest on, and I think at appropriate age, but here's my struggles, and I'm not perfect. I'm no Jesus. So I think that those types of conversations are important for kids to witness and experience. Because, you and I both have seen people come to the student center that have had really devout and devoted parents, but never showed them any struggle. So they assumed that that's how it was supposed to be. And so when they got into their own faith and they dealt with doubt and struggles, they were set up for failure because they always looked at, like, well, my parents always had it together, which maybe wasn't actually the case. They just put up a front. Yeah. And I think another thing is having difficult conversations with your kids, talking about things that are a little uncomfy that you may not have all the answers to. Like, what are the big questions facing Christianity, or what are the big doubts that you might hear or be approached with as you're, growing up and going to school, and especially in college? Why does bad things happen to good people? Why should we believe the biblical text? Like, some of these things that, there's some gray areas, but it's important to have these conversations so kids can be equipped and know how to handle these situations when they come up.
Yeah, I think one of the mistakes parents make is that setting themselves up on this pedestal where they feel like they have to be, super parents to their kids and they have all the answers. And I have found that authenticity with your kids as parents oftentimes leads to a stronger conviction than pretending to have all the answers. And so, I'm not shy about sharing my confusion over certain issues. And, when my kids have said, why did that happen? I don't want to give them just the rote answer, that is like, well, this is all part of God's plan. While that may be true, I can also share with them the fact that, man, I don't understand. It's frustrating. And you know what? Sometimes I do have doubts. And I have these moments where, like in Mark, where the father there is, he says, I believe, and then he turns right around and says, but help my unbelief. Mm-hmm. He's exposing the tension that I think resides in all of us as people of faith, and to hide the fact that we might struggle with our faith issues and not have all the answers and not understand God's timing and God's planning and why he allows certain things to happen, does exactly what you were saying. It sets our kids up for a false narrative that's just not the reality. And if we can prepare them for that and wrestle with those issues at home in the safety and the security and in a place where they have that trust already built, that's what builds a stronger faith. That's what builds stronger conviction. And so if you're a parent listening to this, don't be afraid to show your vulnerability to your kids in those areas and wrestle with those tough questions.
Yeah, and I know, you wrote about this in your book, but it's important for you to be involved in a church and in a community, because there's a lot of statistics and research done that if kids have another spiritual role model aside from their parents, they're more likely to stay in the church. Yeah. And so having a church community where there's other people that they can look at and go to with things they may not feel comfortable going to you with, or having spiritual conversations that they may not feel comfortable having with you, that's an extremely, extremely powerful tool, which all goes back to, your first point is like, it is very important for us to be in a church community, and our kids grow up in those communities.
Yeah, I was beginning to be worried with my oldest son, and he was reaching an age where he knew the Bible. He knew Jesus, and that Jesus had come and was a man here on earth, God in flesh, and died. And this idea of getting to a place of accountability where, what do you do when you believe all those things? Well, Scripture teaches that you need to be baptized. And we had looked at all the Scripture that talks about baptism and why we do it and all of that kind of stuff, and he wouldn't do it. He would. It's just like I'm like waiting for a sign or something. And I had talked to him until I was blue in the face, and nothing that I said, nothing that Betsy said made any difference at all. And then Cody, one of the student ambassadors at that time, just said, "Harrison, what are you doing?" Just had a 10-minute conversation, and the next thing I know, he was ready to be baptized. And so to your point, I mean, that's the power of having people in your life that that are a part of that Christian community that we have.
Yep. And a good example of growing the kingdom, right? So Cody baptized Harrison. Harrison brought me to church. Cody baptized me. Mm-hmm. Harrison, baptized someone a couple months ago. I mean, the kingdom is continually growing because of one or two people in your church community, and your kid can have a huge impact on growing the kingdom. So it's also, this is a disciple relationship an approach we should take in those relationships.
Yeah. Okay, so this next point, I think we have two other points, but I don't think we're going to get to them because I think this next one is going to take up the rest of the time. This was one that we got into a little bit. I think it was the last episode. But it's more related. I said, we could do a whole podcast on this one episode. So maybe half a podcast, because I'm going to try to get into this today. And I don't frequently go back and listen to old podcasts, but I listened to that one specifically because I remember saying, what was it that we said that we needed that was a whole nother podcast? And so as I listened to that podcast, I'm afraid that maybe I came across and said some things that from the female perspective could have been taken like, what are you kidding? So I want to unwrap that a little bit. This is all about, we're talking about raising kids in a world, in a culture that is going to, instill in them the Christian worldview and not be as prone to taking on, what the world looks like. Okay. So the idea of modesty and dress, that was in relationship last week to like social media and the things that they were posting online and that kind of thing. So I want to jump into this, and I want to set this up with some scripture here. So 1 Timothy 2, 9 and 10 talk about modesty and self-control to answer. And, I've heard people say, well, there's nothing that talks about modesty in the Bible. That's entirely false. There is. 1 Peter chapter 3 talks about external appearances, and there's some others there, but just to park it on those two. And then these questions that I pulled after listening to last week's podcast. And I'm going to ask you the question, and then I may have some follow-up on it. Okay, so you made a comment about both boys and girls, male and female, having some accountability there. So the question is, should boys be taught to control their thoughts and actions regardless of what they see?
Yeah, 100%. Because here's the reality. First off, boys are going to see it, whether it be on the internet or at their schools or on social media. I mean, we talked about this. We talked about the exposure to explicit content comes at a super early age. So regardless of what happens, both boys and girls are going to see some form of immodesty, right? Like whether it be full explicit pornographic content or whether it be, someone posting something on social media, whatever it is, they're going to see it. So 100% we should teach boys, sons, to control those thoughts and actions so it doesn't present a problem later, whether it be from content on the internet or whether it be seeing a girl in person.
And this really goes back to parents having the responsibility to teach their kids about where their identity is rooted. Um, because the world's going to teach them that your identity is rooted in how your appearance, how you look, your sexuality. And, you know, if we boil down our identity to, you know, body parts, I mean, that's just ridiculous. So that conversation though does not happen. And if you wait until your kids are late adolescents, entering puberty, having all the pressures and stuff in the world, and seeing, you know, the celebrities dressing, you know, very scantily or whatever, you've waited too late. It's too late to have that conversation. They've already been pulled in, and so any conversation you have at that point is not going to be nearly as effective as if you instill that early on in the child's life and they understand my identity is in Christ. And, you know, age appropriate ways to teach that when they're super young, and then as they get older, you're going to change your teaching technique to reinforce that idea. Should girls be taught to dress in a way that honors God and doesn't invite unnecessary attention?
Yep. Same point here. I mean, I think it's the same core of an issue of where is your identity? You know, where do you place your value? Where do you receive value? You know, for girls, I think, and again, I'm not a girl. I have never had a girl, but
wait a minute. You're not a girl?
No.
I'm sorry, go ahead. You set me up.
So I think it may be for different reasons. It might be attention seeking, or, you know, you talked a little about social media analytics and like likes and engagement into post, and, you know, wanting to feel valued and loved. And so maybe that's part on a father or a mother to, you know, make sure they're getting that attention, but also teaching the most powerful fatherly desire they can experience, which is through God. And on the boy side, you know, it might be a variety of different things, but it's still like, where do you find value and purpose and drive, and what do you want your future to look like? Because these issues here can really impact, I mean, dating life, married life, and there's long consequences for these two situations, because it's where is your value rooted? And if it's not rooted in God, if you don't find identity in God, then that's going to make it really difficult as you progress into adulthood.
Yeah, and so the inevitable question always comes, because this people say, "Oh, it's just so subjective what you wear." You know, how do you ever draw a line? Like, where's the objective standards here on what is appropriate and what is not? And listen, if you're listening to this, I am so sick and tired of having this absolutely asinine conversation with people, because people know, and we need to stop pretending like we don't know what's inappropriate. You know, if you're wearing things on the guy's side, if you're wearing things that are too tight where you can see outlines of body parts, that's not appropriate, and you know that. Why do we even need to sit down and have that conversation? If you're a girl and you're dressing to accentuate the body parts that deal with the reproductive organs or feeding a baby, you know, but because those are biologically visually stimulating things for both male and female. You know, we're talking about body parts. God created us that way. He created us to be attracted to each other in those ways, but He meant for that to be reserved in the confines of a marriage. Mm. So when as single people or as adolescents, we are going out into the world and we are dressing ourselves or not dressing ourselves to accentuate parts that say, hey, look at this body part, then we've crossed the line. Mm-hmm. That's the objective standard there. That's where the line gets drawn. And so responsible parenting looks like having those conversations with your kid before they reach the point where the world is saying, to fit in, you have to dress this way because this is how everybody else is dressing. Mm-hmm. Is that going to create some issues at home and some hard arguments and conversations and fights? Yep. It is. And just moms and dads need to prepare for the battle on that and understand that if you've done the work before, and establish those guidelines. And when you get to those points, the fighting, there will be some, but it's not going to be nearly as hard as if you had not had those conversations. What are your thoughts now as a younger guy that doesn't have a daughter?
I think another thing that I think about is confidence. If you have self-confidence in knowing who you belong to and where, again, Imago Dei, going back to that, like if you have confidence in that, then that perspective changes everything.
Yeah.
Because I don't need to dress this way. I don't need to be this way or change. It doesn't just go into visual appearance, but it also goes in like personalities. People changing their personalities or doing things they wouldn't normally do to fit into a certain crowd or attract a certain person, or to be in a relationship, they have to do these different things. Like those are all rooted in insecurity and
Absolutely.
lack of confidence. And so if we can teach our kids to have those tools to build that confidence, and I get there's so many other factors, right? Social media, social norms and culture and peer. I mean, there's so many factors, right? It's not easy, but I'm just saying, like, providing those resources so you can have those conversations and discussions with your kids to begin them thinking through where's their value? Where is it placed?
Yeah, what you're saying here is raising kids to view modesty as a heart posture and not as a dress code.
Right.
Because that's the heart of the issue there, really. And when you have a child that understands that, and that, by the way, moms and dads, listen to this, that can be taught from an early age. And, it takes moms and dads both pouring into their kids, establishing that identity where when they're older, they don't even want to look at celebrities or look at their friends and see, and they've got eyes in their head. They can see how they're dressing and how boys are looking at girls that dress that way and how girls are looking at boys that dress that way. They're able to see that and pick up on that. And at that point, even at a young age, understand what's actually happening there, which is a super cool thing if parents have done their work.
Yeah, and it's important for men and for boys to, how do we view women and girls, right? They're not objects. We're not objectifying them. And so how do you teach that as a parent to a child of like, this is a person, this is someone that God's created, and it's important to look again at heart posture, your own heart posture, their heart posture, to really make an assessment of like, is this someone that's compatible? Obviously thinking, much later down the road, but I think it's very important for us to talk about these things. And again, this kind of goes back to what we were talking about a minute ago, but these aren't easy conversations.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think, I don't know, maybe you're just biting at the bullet to have these conversations with your kids, but I don't think so.
No.
So, these are difficult conversations. They're uncomfortable. They're easy to just maybe never have, or I'm on autopilot, I'm not going to think about that, or I'm going to wait till it's too late. These are things that we need to start talking about early.
And dads can have the conversations too with their daughters. And I just thinking about the types of conversations I had when, like, you're driving, having a father-daughter date, and engaging your young daughter in conversations like, tell me what you think about how your mom dresses, where you're connecting now a godly example to somebody and really getting the feedback from your daughter. And then that becomes a teaching moment. And it's done in a way where it's not going to embarrass or shock, or it just feels weird and awkward. And those are the types of conversations that you are intentionally planning. Dads, I'm talking to dads specifically, because dads honestly play a bigger role on this with both sexes, okay? Because you mentioned it before, identity with daughters. One of the, man, there's so much here, I feel like I'm talking so fast. There's a lot of psychological stuff going on in the female brain and her appearance and her acceptance and her identity that are rooted in the relationship that she has with a father. If there's a father figure, a good, healthy father figure. Okay, so there's part of that. But then the boys also are looking at their dad as examples as well. So dads play a huge part in this. And so dads, if you're listening to this, you need to understand that it is your responsibility. You're the primary teacher on this, and you're going to model this behavior for both your daughter and your son in these ways. Not to say that mom doesn't have a big part to play in this, because she does. She needs to have other conversations with her daughter that the dad can't have. And so that needs to be taking place as well. but dads need to be building up their daughter, understanding that if you're not engaging your child in ways that uncover these things and bring up ways to have these dialogues, somebody else is going to do it. And it's not going to be the person that you want influencing your child.
Yep. And here's another thing. I mean, I think you would have to look at yourself as a parent as where's your heart posture? Yeah. Where do you find your value and your confidence? And, same for your spouse. I mean, those are important things to begin thinking about, now before you have kids, or even if you already have one. Like, again, that's important too, because kids are very observant. They notice a lot.
What's interesting is that dads don't really think about this in terms of how women are dressed until they have their own daughter, and then they begin to realize, that this is a problem. Mm-hmm. That's if I could get parents to understand, especially men to understand that, those girls that you're looking at when you were a teenager, when you were in college, that's somebody's daughter, and when you have a daughter someday, you're going to understand way better if we can get in that mindset before that time, so that becomes ingrained and instilled. That would be a good thing. Closing thoughts, final thoughts.
Well, this was an interesting episode, especially not as a parent, but I think it's important to remember. We've talked a lot about a variety of different issues, but I think there's a central theme emerging, and it's community. It's church community, and there are so many complex issues in our culture and what we're dealing with. You might be a parent, you might be a spouse, you might be single, you might, whatever it might be, whatever sin that you might be dealing with, there is a central theme of community being extremely powerful as a tool. And I think that's why Christ gave it to us. So, that's my thought. I think it's important for us to be plugged into a church community, and one that we can root ourselves in and be held accountable.
I thought you were going to say the emerging thing here in all of these is identity. But church community, yes, absolutely. We should get like a board here and just like start putting up, plugging in the main themes. Maybe that would be a cool thing to do.
I think identity is, but community is almost like the practicality, of how you get there. So
yeah. Well, I hear the music. That's Parker trying to say.
It's time to go.
Wrap it up. All right. So thanks for listening. Join us on all of our social media outlets and platforms that we've got. They're on all the places. A shout out to our sponsor, Central Church of Christ and Ministry League. They do a great job in all the things allowing us to do this and plugging us. Until our next episode of The Lion, the Way, and the War, be kind to one another, love one another, and remember, the Creator of the universe loves you so much that He gave up His only Son for you. Have a blessed day.